Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're not chasing kings or pharaohs or dramatic battles. Nope. Tonight we're slowing all the way down. We're dimming the lights, sinking into bed, and wandering through the daily life of the ordinary people of ancient Egypt. And let's be honest, you've probably seen enough documentaries about the pyramids and Ramses strutting around like he owned the Nile, which, fair enough, he sort of did. But what about the farmers, the bakers, the house builders, the fishermen, the people who didn't get giant gold tombs but still had to get up every morning and make things work? That's where we're going tonight. So just relax. Close your eyes if you want. Imagine the sound of the Nile in the distance, some frogs making that weird little nighttime chorus they do, and a whole lot of mosquitoes because yes, they were absolutely there. And let's drift into the slow rhythm of life 3,000 years ago, in the land of sand, stone, and surprisingly stubborn bread. Life in ancient Egypt, if you weren't royalty, was, well, it was a mix. On the one hand, you lived in one of the most fertile river valleys in the world. The Nile basically said, hey, here's free food every year, and dumped rich black silt all over the floodplain. Which was great, because without it Egypt is basically endless desert. On the other hand, you had to deal with heat that made even the gods sweat, a whole calendar based on whether or not the river was behaving, and the occasional bossy pharaoh demanding more grain taxes while he lounged around in a palace. So, daily life was simple, but not easy. And the rhythm of it all was tied, almost hypnotically, to the river itself. The Nile flooded, you farmed. The Nile receded, you harvested. And if the Nile decided to be stingy one year? Well, congratulations, you and your neighbors got famine. Let's start in the morning. Picture an ordinary mud brick house. And when I say mud brick, I really mean mud brick. Most Egyptian houses were built from the stuff, which was cheap and easy, but also meant that if you left it alone too long it sort of melted back into the earth. That's why archaeologists don't find many complete villages, they basically just disintegrated. The houses were usually small, 1 or 2 rooms, with flat roofs. And guess what those roofs were for? Yep, sleeping. Because who wants to be inside a stuffy clay oven when the night air is at least somewhat cooler? Families often slept on the roof, under the stars, swatting at mosquitoes and pretending the sand didn't get everywhere. Which, of course, it did. Inside, things were basic. A couple of reed mats, some clay jars for grain and beer, maybe a little niche for a household god, because even if you were poor, you still wanted someone up there looking out for you, or at least pretending to. Furniture was minimal. Maybe a stool if you were fancy. Tables were low to the ground. Beds, when they existed, were wooden frames with woven reeds, and I'm just going to say it, they probably weren't exactly spa-quality comfort. So, morning. The sun rises, brutally, because there's no such thing as a soft dawn in Egypt. You probably got up early, partly because of the heat, partly because you had work, and partly because the chickens and donkeys were already making enough noise to ruin any chance of a snooze button. Breakfast wasn't glamorous. Most days it was bread and beer. And when I say beer, don't get excited, this wasn't a nice crisp lager. Egyptian beer was thick, murky, and probably had chunks floating in it. More like liquid bread with a hint of fermentation. But hey, it was calories, and safer than Nile water, which came with an exciting bonus package of parasites. So, beer for breakfast. Because why not? The bread, meanwhile, was legendary. And not in a good way. They baked loaves using grinding stones, which left bits of grit and sand in the flour. Over time, that meant everyone's teeth wore down to sad little stubs. If you were an ancient Egyptian adult, chances are you had dental problems. Cavities, abscesses, infections. And no dentists. Just, deal with it. Nothing says, good morning, like biting into your daily bread and feeling your molars cry for mercy. After breakfast, it was time for work. If you were a farmer, your day revolved around the Nile's moods. You might be sowing wheat, barley, or emmer, which is the ancient ancestor of modern wheat. You might be tending to flax for linen, or vegetables like onions, garlic, and cucumbers. Egyptians loved garlic. Honestly, they were obsessed. It shows up in medicine, religion, even wages for workers. So if you ever wondered where that strong garlic breath started, just imagine entire villages reeking together in harmony. Tools were simple: wooden plows, hoes, sickles with flint blades. Nothing flashy, just effective. The animals did the heavy pulling. And of course, everything had to be done in that brutal sun. Shade was a luxury, and hats were basically strips of cloth tied around the head. Sunscreen? No. Just burn, peel, repeat. If you weren't farming, maybe you were a craftsman. Carpenters, stonemasons, potters, all valuable, all working long hours with hand tools. Potters spun clay on wheels, shaped it into jars, baked it in kilns. Carpenters built boats, furniture, and coffins, because let's be real, coffins were a booming industry in Egypt. And then there were scribes. The lucky ones. If you could write, you didn't have to sweat in the fields. Instead, you sat around copying tax records, prayers, or royal decrees onto papyrus. Glamorous? Not really. But it was steady work, and you got to avoid sunstroke. Plus, writing with a reed brush in black and red ink had a certain aesthetic, even if most of what you were writing was, "Farmer so-and-so owes this much grain, still hasn't paid." Bureaucracy has been boring for thousands of years. Now, food. Because that's always important. Egyptian meals were simple, repetitive, and gritty. Bread, beer, and more bread. Occasionally lentils, beans, onions. Meat was a luxury. Maybe fish if you lived near the river, or duck and goose if you were lucky. Cattle were too valuable to eat most of the time, they were draft animals. So regular folks didn't sit down to steak dinners. Fruits. Dates, figs, pomegranates, melons. Sweet, seasonal, and actually delicious. Honey was the main sweetener, but it was expensive. Sugar, of course, didn't exist yet. So if you wanted dessert, it was basically dates mashed with nuts, maybe some honey if you splurged. Let's drift over to family life. Most Egyptians married young. Women often in their early teens, men a little older once they could afford a household. Marriage wasn't some huge religious ceremony. It was more like an agreement: we live together now, here's a contract, let's have kids. Divorce was common and actually pretty simple: just declare it, divide the property, done. Which, considering later societies, was surprisingly progressive. Women had more rights in Egypt than in many other ancient places. They could own property, run businesses, represent themselves in court. Of course, most still spent their days grinding grain, raising kids, and fetching water, but legally at least, they weren't invisible. Children, meanwhile, ran around mostly naked until adolescence, because clothes are overrated when it's 100 degrees. They played with toys, little carved animals, balls, dolls with wigs. And yes, parents definitely yelled at them for being noisy. Some things never change. Let's not forget religion, because in Egypt, it seeped into everything. The gods weren't distant. They were everywhere, in the river, in the sun, in the cats knocking jars off shelves. Every home had little statues or offerings to local deities. And everyone, even the poorest farmer, lived with the constant awareness that someday, hopefully many years later, there'd be an afterlife waiting. That's why tombs mattered so much. Even the humble ones had little offerings of bread, beer, and trinkets, just in case the soul needed a snack on the way to eternity. Cats, of course, were sacred. Part pest control, part divine presence, all attitude. If your family had a cat, you treated it well. Accidentally killing a cat, even by stepping on it, was a serious offense. Which honestly makes sense. You don't anger Batet, the cat goddess, unless you want eternal side-eye. By evening, life wound down. People gathered on their rooftops, ate their bread and beer, maybe shared a little stew or roasted vegetables. They chatted, watched the stars, listened to the sounds of the river. Entertainment was simple, music from flutes, drums, or harps, storytelling, games like Senet, kind of like ancient snakes and ladders, but with extra mysticism. And then, sleep. Not in soft beds, not with air conditioning, but under the stars, with the faint hope that tomorrow's bread would have slightly less sand in it. So yeah, daily life in ancient Egypt was repetitive, gritty, and not exactly glamorous. But it worked. The rhythm of the Nile kept things moving. People farmed, ate, raised families, worshipped, and died. The pharaohs may have gotten the monuments, but the real heartbeat of Egypt was in the villages, the mud brick houses, the endless grinding of grain, and the slow flow of the river. And if that sounds boring, well, perfect. That's exactly what we're here for tonight. Alright, so we've woken up with the average Egyptian, chewed our way through some stone-textured bread, and spent a day sweating under the Nile sun. But of course, society isn't just farmers and bread chewers. There were a whole lot of other jobs, some surprisingly relatable, some utterly bizarre, that kept the wheels of Egyptian daily life slowly grinding along. So let's drift through some of those. First up, the fisherman. Fishing sounds kind of idyllic, right? Just you, the river, a calm morning, maybe a reed boat rocking slightly while you cast your net. And yes, sometimes it was like that. But more often, it was sweaty, smelly, and came with the constant risk of crocodiles. Which, by the way, the Nile had plenty of. Egyptian fishermen used all sorts of techniques. Nets, harpoons, baskets, even bare hands. Fish like tilapia, catfish, and perch were common catches. And of course, they dried and salted a lot of it for later, because ancient refrigerators were, well, non-existent. And there was a weird little twist, fish weren't just food. They were also tied up with religion. Certain fish were considered sacred or off-limits depending on the region. So imagine being a fisherman and having to remember which town would look at your catch and say, delicious, and which would gasp in horror and call it blasphemy. Nothing like turning dinner into a theological crisis. Then, laundry workers. Because yes, even in ancient Egypt, somebody had to deal with everyone's sweaty linen tunics. Laundry wasn't some gentle little soak and scrub. No, Egyptian washers basically beat the living daylights out of clothes. They soaked them in a mix of water and natron, a kind of naturally occurring soda ash, and then stomped on them, slapped them, and scrubbed them on stones. Which, if you're thinking, that can't have been good for the fabric, you're right. Clothes wore out quickly. But hey, at least they came out somewhat clean, and probably slightly scratchy. And speaking of linen, let's talk about flax workers. Linen was the fabric of choice in Egypt. Wool was technically available, but it was hot, itchy, and considered ritually impure in many contexts. Linen, made from the flax plant, was light, breathable, and perfect for desert life. Except for the part where producing it was incredibly tedious. Harvest the flax. Soak it until it rots. Beat it. Dry it. Spin it. Weave it. Dye it. By the time you got a tunic out of the process, it had gone through more steps than a modern tax return. Now, one of the more glamorous jobs, if you could call it that, the perfume maker. Egyptians were big on scents. Which makes sense, considering how hot and sweaty life was. Perfumes, oils, and unguents were everywhere. People wore them daily, offered them to gods, even buried them in tombs. Perfume making was basically a mix of crushing flowers, herbs, and resins, then steeping them in oil or fat. some favorites: myrrh, frankincense, lotus, cinnamon. Yes, cinnamon, though that had to be imported at great expense. So if you were walking around smelling faintly of cinnamon lotus oil, you were basically a walking luxury good. And here's the fun part, they didn't just dab it on. Egyptians sometimes wore little wax cones of scented fat on their heads at parties. The idea was that, as the cone melted, it released fragrance. Romantic in theory. Until you picture melted wax trickling down your hair and neck. But hey, beauty is pain. Or in this case, beauty is being slightly greasy all night. Of course, someone had to make beer. And honestly, that was almost a sacred job, considering how much beer Egyptians consumed. Beer brewing wasn't exactly craft brewing with fancy hops and tasting notes. It was more like, bake bread, crumble it into water, let it ferment, strain it, and hope for the best. The result was thick, cloudy, and probably tasted like sour porridge. But it got the job done. Workers on royal building projects were often literally paid in bread and beer. Which sounds like a dream until you realize it was your only form of wages and nutrition. But still, better than nothing. Now, let's float over to entertainment workers. Because yes, even in ancient Egypt, people needed distractions. Musicians, dancers, and storytellers were a big part of life. Harps, flutes, lutes, tambourines, these weren't just for temples or palaces. Even small gatherings had music. Dancers often performed in groups, sometimes with acrobatics, sometimes with a level of suggestiveness that made Egyptian art surprisingly cheeky. Storytellers, meanwhile, carried oral traditions. They'd spin tales of gods, heroes, or just ridiculous everyday misadventures. Which makes sense, because after 12 hours of farming in the sun, you'd probably want to hear a story about a clever peasant outsmarting his boss. Escapism, ancient edition. And then, of course, there were the embalmers. The people who made sure your afterlife wardrobe included, well, your actual body. This job had a very specific skill set. Washing the body, removing the organs, drying everything out with natron, wrapping it in linen, and throwing in amulets for good measure. Embalmers weren't necessarily glamorous, but they were respected. After all, you didn't want just anyone in charge of making sure you looked presentable for eternity. And, let's be honest, they had to deal with some pretty grim realities. Natron baths weren't exactly fragrant, and wrapping hundreds of feet of linen around a slowly dehydrating corpse doesn't sound like the best working environment. But somebody had to do it. And hey, job security. People weren't going to stop dying. We can't forget the scribes, either. I touched on them earlier, but they deserve a little more attention. Scribes were the original office workers. They learned hieroglyphs, hieratic script, math, and accounting. And once you were in, you had a cushy job compared to farming. Scribes handled tax records, legal disputes, temple inventories, letters, everything. And they wrote on papyrus, which, by the way, was another tedious production process. Harvest the papyrus plant. Slice the stalk. Lay the strips crosswise. Pound it flat. Dry it. Smooth it. Congratulations, you've got paper. And now some poor guy is going to cover it with endless rows of Farmer Mary still owes 3 sacks of barley, deadline overdue. Bureaucracy is eternal. Scribes also copied literature, though, hymns, prayers, wisdom texts, even love poems. And sometimes, they got a little snarky. There are surviving school exercises where trainee scribes wrote things like, "Don't be a farmer, it's too hard. Be a scribe, it's much better." Which basically proves that career propaganda existed even in 1500 BCE. Speaking of snarky, let's talk about fashion and grooming. Egyptians cared a lot about appearance. Cleanliness was big. Daily bathing was common, usually in the river. Soap as we know it didn't exist, but natron and oils did the trick. People shaved or kept hair cropped short, because lice were not cute. Wigs were popular, for both men and women, and came in different styles depending on fashion trends. Imagine a whole society where wigs weren't just for costume parties, but actual daily life. Makeup? Absolutely. Men and women alike used black kohl eyeliner, partly for looks, partly because it helped reduce glare from the sun. Green eye paint made from malachite was also popular. And lipstick? Crushed red ochre. So yes, if you time travel back to ancient Egypt, you'd basically see a society of people wearing eyeliner, wigs, and linen tunics. It was like a desert-wide fashion runway, just with more mosquitoes. And finally, let's not forget the pets. Cats, obviously, were the stars. Sacred, pampered, worshipped. But Egyptians also kept dogs, monkeys, and even ibises. Dogs were especially valued for hunting and companionship. And monkeys, well, they were probably less pets and more chaotic little gremlins running around stealing food. But still, they show up in art, so clearly someone thought it was a good idea. So, that's a slow drift through the jobs, habits, and odd little corners of daily Egyptian life. Nothing too glamorous, nothing too shocking. Just people, day after day, fishing, weaving, brewing, grooming, raising cats, and trying not to get heatstroke. And honestly, it's kind of comforting. Strip away the pyramids and mummies, and ancient Egyptians weren't so different from us. They worked, they complained about work, they dressed up, they worried about their hair, they spoiled their pets. And then they went to bed, ready to do it all again. So, picture this. You've worked yourself half to death in the blazing sun, your tunic is basically glued to you with sweat, and your stomach is begging for more than bread mush. What's the cure? Answer, a festival. And ancient Egyptians had a lot of festivals. Think of them as a mix between national holidays, religious processions, and full-blown block parties. Except with fewer fireworks and a lot more beer. Let's start with the Festival of Opet. This one was centered in Thebes, modern-day Luxor, and was all about the god Ammonius. Basically, Ammonius' statue got carried from his main temple at Karnak down to Luxor Temple, usually in a grand procession that lasted several days. Priests, dancers, musicians, offerings, the whole deal. For the average person, it was an excuse to take a break, drink, and cheer as divine statues rolled by on boats. Because nothing says religious devotion like getting tipsy by the river while a golden god floats past. And then there was the beautiful Festival of the Valley, which, spoiler alert, also involved a lot of drinking. Families would go across the Nile to the West Bank, picnic in the cemeteries, and visit their ancestors. So yes, ancient Egyptians basically invented the idea of tailgating with grandma's tomb. Bring some food, pour some beer, say hi to the deceased. It was a family reunion with just a few people missing, technically. Now, if you're thinking, wow, they really drank a lot, yes. Beer and wine were everywhere at festivals. Music too. Harps, flutes, rattles, clapping. And dancing, which sometimes got, let's say, energetic. Egyptian festival art sometimes shows dancers with very little clothing and poses that would make your yoga instructor blush. Let's just say they weren't exactly afraid of turning religious holidays into a slightly rowdy night out. But everyday leisure didn't require a festival. Ordinary folks had games, too. One of the most famous was Senet. Imagine a grid board, 30 squares, and a mix of strategy and luck. People played it at home, in taverns, even in tombs, because of course you needed something to pass the time in the afterlife. It's basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of leaving a deck of cards in your grave. And Senet wasn't just for fun. Over time, it took on spiritual meaning, symbolizing the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Which means that every time you played, you weren't just killing time, you were practicing your eternal cosmic road trip. No pressure. Another game was Mehen, also called the Game of the Snake. It had a circular board shaped like a coiled serpent. Players moved pieces along the snake's body, and the rules are a little fuzzy because historians aren't entirely sure how it worked. But let's be honest, half the fun of board games is arguing about the rules anyway. And then there were dice-like games. Not dice as we know them, but throwing sticks or knucklebones that landed in different positions. Ancient Egyptians basically invented Yahtzee, but with livestock parts. For more active fun, there was wrestling. Wrestling shows up a lot in Egyptian art, two men grappling, throwing each other around, sometimes even referees watching. It was sport, training, and probably entertainment for a bored crowd. And considering linen tunics weren't exactly athletic gear, you can picture how awkward it must have looked. There were also hunting trips, at least for the wealthy. Ducks, antelope, even hippopotamus hunting. And yes, hunting hippos was as dangerous as it sounds. But hey, if you were a nobleman with nothing better to do, why not risk getting mauled by a giant, angry river beast? Prestige points, I guess. Now, let's move indoors again. Imagine it's evening. The sun has set. The day's work is over. What do Egyptians do? They eat, of course. Dinner was usually another round of bread, some vegetables, maybe fish if you were lucky, maybe meat if you were really lucky. And then, entertainment. Storytelling was huge. Folktales, myths, and humorous stories passed down orally. Some were about gods tricking each other, others about ordinary people stumbling into weird situations. Ancient Egyptian bedtime stories basically mixed moral lessons with ridiculous comedy. They also loved music at home. Small flutes, lutes, hand drums. Nothing fancy, just enough to set a mood. Imagine family jam sessions, minus the awkward teenage guitar solos. And let's not skip over the romantic side of things. Ancient Egyptians actually had a pretty vibrant tradition of love poetry. Some of it survives, written on papyrus or ostraca, broken pottery shards used as scratch paper. And these poems are surprisingly tender. They talk about longing, kisses, the beauty of a lover's voice. So yes, even 3,000 years ago, people were scribbling down what were basically love song lyrics. Only with fewer Taylor Swift references. Oh, and here's a fun little leisure activity, pet care. Cats were pampered. Dogs were collared and walked. Some wealthy folks even kept gazelles or monkeys. Which sounds cute until you remember monkeys will absolutely destroy your house for fun. But hey, what's a little chaos between friends? So, leisure in ancient Egypt wasn't exactly about luxury spas or Netflix binges. It was simple: festivals, board games, music, wrestling, storytelling, and the occasional romantic poem. Enough to break up the grind of farming and laundry stomping. And honestly, it worked. Life was hard, but they found joy in it. They drank, they danced, they sang, they played. Because even in a world without Wi-Fi, humans still wanted to laugh, relax, and occasionally argue over board game rules. And with that, let's lazily drift towards something Egyptians were really obsessed with: death, tombs, and the afterlife. Because nothing says sleepy history like imagining eternity wrapped up in linen. So picture this: you're an ancient Egyptian farmer, sweating in the fields, and suddenly you stub your toe, get an infection, and, well, it's curtains. That's it. Short, simple, done. Life expectancy was not exactly generous. But here's the comforting twist: they didn't really see death as an ending. It was more like moving houses. You just packed up, said goodbye to your mud brick shack, and relocated into the great beyond. And the Egyptians were obsessed with making sure that move went smoothly. The tomb situation. Now, your tomb depended entirely on your budget. Poor folks got shallow pits in the desert sand, wrapped in a simple shroud. Honestly, not terrible. The hot, dry climate basically did the mummification for you. A natural budget burial package. Middle-class people had mud brick tombs, maybe a few possessions tucked in, a bowl, some bread, a good luck charm. The elite? Oh boy. They went all out. Carved stone tombs, painted walls, statues of themselves looking smug, entire food pantries of offerings, and sometimes even a few servant figurines, called ashabti, that were meant to magically come to life in the afterlife to do the chores. Because apparently, even in eternity, you didn't want to weed your own barley. And of course, the pharaohs took it to a whole new level. Pyramids, giant temples, labyrinthine tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It wasn't enough to just die. You had to die in style, preferably leaving behind a structure so big that tourists would still be blocking traffic to see it thousands of years later. Mummification 101. Now, let's talk about everyone's favorite slightly creepy hobby, mummification. If you could afford it, the process was, well, intense. Step 1, remove the squishy stuff. The brain. Pulled out through the nose with a hook. Because apparently, that was the most efficient method. Lungs, stomach, intestines. All out. Each one carefully embalmed and stored in canopic jars with cute little animal-headed lids. The heart, though, that stayed in, because Egyptians believed it was the seat of the soul and your moral compass. Which, honestly, is kind of poetic. Step 2, stuff the body with resin, spices, and natron, a kind of salt, to dry everything out. Basically, turn yourself into human jerky. Step 3, wrap it all up in linen, layer after layer. Sometimes with little amulets tucked inside, like lucky charms for the great beyond. And step 4, more resin to glue it all in place. You emerge from this process looking less like a person and more like a particularly dedicated craft project. The Afterlife Starter Pack. But what good is a mummy without the right gear? Egyptians believed you'd need your stuff in the afterlife. So tombs got stocked with food, beer, clothing, tools, jewelry, and even furniture. Yes, people literally got buried with their favorite chairs. Apparently, eternity without your favorite recliner was unthinkable. And then there were the books of the dead. These weren't single books, but collections of spells, prayers, and instructions written on papyrus, walls, or coffins. Basically, a cosmic cheat sheet. Because navigating the afterlife was no joke, there were gates, trials, monsters, and tests. And you did not want to show up unprepared. Judgment Day, Egyptian edition. So here's how it went, according to their mythology. After death, your soul made its way to the Hall of Ma'at. There, the god Anubis, jackal head, chill demeanor, weighed your heart against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. If your heart was lighter than the feather, congrats. You were pure, and you got eternal paradise. If your heart was heavier, well, sorry. It got tossed to Ammit, the devourer, a monster with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the backside of a hippo. Which sounds like a zoo had a bad day. One chomp, and your soul was gone forever. Eternal obliteration. So yeah, no pressure. Just keep your heart feather light and you'll be fine. Eternal paradise. What was paradise like? Imagine the best version of Egypt you could think of, fertile fields, endless food, calm waters, and no boss yelling at you to haul bricks in the sun. For farmers, it was basically a never-ending harvest with none of the back pain. For nobles, it was banquets, wine, music, and lounging forever. Of course, you still had to work a little in the afterlife, which is where those Ashabti figurines came in. They were supposed to do the boring jobs for you, which is why wealthy Egyptians buried themselves with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of them. Like ghostly personal assistants on eternal standby. Ghosts and hauntings. Now, just because Egyptians were big on the afterlife doesn't mean they ignored the spooky side. They believed the dead could get restless and come back as ghosts. Which, let's be honest, probably explains why they were so obsessive about making tombs comfy. Last thing you want is Uncle Khufu wandering back because you forgot to pack enough beer. So, to sum up, Egyptians treated death not as a tragic end, but as a bureaucratic process with a lot of paperwork, linen bandages, and, if you were lucky, a pyramid. The living poured time, money, and energy into preparing for it, because eternity was a really long time to regret forgetting your favorite chair. And with that, let's gently drift away from the tombs and mummies. In part 5, we'll sink into the politics and pharaoh drama, the strange, messy, slightly dysfunctional lives of the people who supposedly ruled all this. Spoiler, even with gold crowns and pyramids, they were often complete disasters. So, here's the thing about pharaohs: on paper, they were divine. Children of the gods, semi-immortal, and the glue holding the universe together. In reality, they were human beings with suspicious family trees, fragile egos, and a tendency to overcompensate with giant building projects. Let's wander through a few of the more memorable ones. King Narmer, Mr. First Pharaoh. We'll start at the beginning, around 3100 BCE. Meet Narmer, the guy credited with uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. He's usually shown wearing both crowns, the tall white one and the squat red one, as if to say, see? I can accessorize. Narmer's claim to fame was basically, he smashed his enemies' heads in and declared one Egypt instead of two. Not exactly subtle, but effective. He also kicked off the tradition of pharaohs making their accomplishments look way bigger than they probably were. A habit that would, let's be honest, never go away. The pyramid enthusiasts. Fast forward a few dynasties, and we hit the Old Kingdom, the Age of Pyramids. Snefru, for instance. He was like the trial and error guy of pyramid construction. First, he built the bent pyramid, which, as the name suggests, bent halfway up because the angle was too steep. Instead of admitting defeat, he just built another one, the Red Pyramid, which worked better. Classic overachiever move. Then his son Khufu went all in with the Great Pyramid of Giza. Enormous, precise, and still standing after 4,500 years. Impressive, right? Except ancient Egyptians themselves didn't actually like Khufu very much. Later writings describe him as a bit of a tyrant, the kind of boss who would absolutely cut your rations for showing up late. Which means the Great Pyramid is basically history's most expensive overcompensation project. Pepi II, the Eternal Child King. Then there's Pepi II, who came to the throne as a child and supposedly ruled for over 90 years. Which sounds impressive until you realize he started treating the throne like his personal toy. One story goes that he loved honey so much he'd order naked slaves to smear themselves with it so flies wouldn't bother him. That's not divine wisdom. That's a spoiled toddler with absolute power. And if you're wondering how his dynasty eventually collapsed, well, that kind of decision-making might have had something to do with it. The Middle Kingdom, soap opera time. The Middle Kingdom gets less press than pyramids or Tutankhamun, but it's basically Egypt's moody teenager phase. Kings built fewer massive monuments and focused on administration, art, and, of course, squabbling with one another. Pharaohs here had to work harder to keep the country glued together. Which often meant propping themselves up as semi-divine workaholics while their court officials quietly gained more and more power. Think of it as the Egyptian version of, the interns running the company while the CEO gives motivational speeches. Hatshepsut, the queen who said, why not? Now let's talk about Hatshepsut, one of the most fascinating rulers. She was technically supposed to just be a regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But she looked at the throne, looked at the chaos, and said, I'll just keep this. She styled herself as pharaoh, even wearing the false beard, and spent her reign building monuments, trading with faraway lands, and proving she could out-king the kings. She even had this gorgeous mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which is still standing and still jaw-dropping. Of course, after her death, her stepson tried to erase her name from history, chiseling it off walls, smashing statues, the whole deal. Nothing says, "I'm secure in my masculinity," quite like trying to delete your stepmom from existence. Akhenaten, the weird one. And then, there's Akhenaten, Egypt's oddball pharaoh. Around 1350 BCE, he decided, you know what, one god is enough. So he tossed out Egypt's entire pantheon and centered everything around Aten, the sun disk. Radical religious reform, brand new city, strange elongated art style, basically, a whole cultural reset. Problem was, nobody else seemed into it. Priests, citizens, nobles, everyone side-eyed this new sun-worshipping cult. And after Akhenaten died, his reforms collapsed almost immediately. Egyptians basically said, cool experiment, let's never do that again. Tutankhamun, the overhyped teen. Which brings us to Tutankhamun, aka King Tut. Honestly, he wasn't that important in life. He was a young boy, died around 18, and ruled for maybe a decade. His real claim to fame? His tomb survived looters. That's it. When Howard Carter opened it in 1922, it was crammed full of golden treasures, furniture, chariots, jewelry, even his bed. And the world went wild. Tut went from obscure teenage king to global superstar, all because grave robbers got distracted for a few millennia. Ironically, Tut probably had a rough life. He was the product of inbreeding, had a clubfoot, likely needed a cane, and suffered from various health problems. So the boy king remembered as a glittering golden god was, in reality, a sickly teenager shuffled onto the throne. History's sense of humor at work again. Ramesses II, Mr. PR King. Finally, we can't skip Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great. He ruled for 66 years, built colossal statues of himself everywhere, and signed what is considered the world's first known peace treaty. He also fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, which he immediately declared as a glorious victory. Reality check, it was more like a draw. But Ramesses was such a propaganda master that, thousands of years later, people still remember him as Egypt's ultimate conqueror. He even built entire temples that basically screamed, "Look at me, I'm amazing." So, to sum it up, the pharaohs were divine kings in theory, but in practice? They were insecure, eccentric, power-hungry humans like the rest of us. They built monuments to themselves, rewrote history when it didn't suit them, and left behind some of the messiest dynastic drama you'll ever see carved into stone. And with that, we'll gently close this part of the royal scrapbook. In part 6, we'll slip into palace life, what royal families ate, how they schemed, and all the bizarre little habits that made ancient Egyptian elites so memorable. So, what was it really like to live as a pharaoh or part of the royal squad? You might picture glistening feasts, Cleopatra-style lounging, and servants fanning you with palm leaves. And yes, there was some of that. But mostly, the royal household was just a much fancier version of an ordinary Egyptian home, with a lot more scheming, inbreeding, and incense to cover up the smell of goat dung drifting in from outside. The palaces themselves. Let's start with the buildings. Pharaohs didn't actually live in pyramids. Those were strictly for the afterlife, basically retirement homes you never leave. In life, palaces were made of mud brick. Yes, mud brick. Not exactly eternal stone. Which is why so many of them just melted back into the desert. From what archaeologists can tell, the palaces were sprawling complexes with painted walls, gardens, pools, and columned halls. Imagine something halfway between a luxury villa and a bureaucratic office. Because remember, a palace wasn't just a house. It was the kingdom's control center. People came and went constantly. Scribes with papyrus rolls, priests with complaints, foreign ambassadors sweating in the sun while waiting for an audience. The royal family had private quarters tucked away, but privacy? Not really a thing. Even your bedroom was probably crawling with servants, guards, and distant cousins hoping to inherit something. Food fit for a pharaoh. Now, let's peek at the royal dinner table. The pharaoh's pantry looked like the national treasury of food. Bread, beer, vegetables, honey, figs, dates, melons, fish, and meat, usually beef, duck, or goose. Meat was rare for peasants, but for royals? It was Tuesday. They also had spices and luxuries imported from abroad. Cinnamon, pomegranates, wine, the kind of stuff peasants probably never even saw. And of course, lots of honey. Ancient Egyptians used honey for everything. Cooking, medicine, offerings to the gods. It was basically the duct tape of the ancient kitchen. Banquets were a thing, too. Imagine long tables piled with food, musicians playing lutes, dancers twirling around, and servants constantly refilling wine jugs. Sounds fun, except banquets also meant listening to nobles brag about their achievements while trying not to spill lentil stew on your linen kilt. Family life, awkward and complicated. Now, royal families. Brace yourself. Pharaohs married, a lot. Queens, secondary wives, concubines, and sometimes their own sisters. Because nothing says, keep it in the family, like actually keeping it in the family. To them, sibling marriage wasn't seen as gross. It was divine. After all, the gods married their siblings, so why shouldn't the king? Of course, the genetic results were less than divine. By the time we get to poor Tutankhamun, his family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot of branches stabbing into each other. He ended up with a clubfoot, scoliosis, and possibly malaria. A walking advertisement for why maybe marrying your sister isn't the best idea. Children of the pharaoh were raised in the palace with tutors, servants, and priests teaching them reading, writing, religion, and, most importantly, how to play politics before they were old enough to drink beer. Because being royal wasn't about having fun. It was about making sure you didn't get assassinated by uncle, definitely not loyal, in the throne room. Queens and royal women. Royal women had it complicated. The great royal wife, basically the queen, held serious symbolic power. She performed rituals, appeared on monuments, and sometimes acted as regent. But she also had to compete with dozens of other wives and concubines. Imagine trying to host brunch in a palace where your husband has 50 girlfriends and each one thinks her son should be king. Honestly, the palace must have been one of the most exhausting workplaces in history. Yet some women thrived. Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Cleopatra, they weren't just passive consorts. They played the game hard and sometimes took the throne for themselves. Which meant being a royal woman could either crush you, or catapult you into legendary status. Daily habits and quirks. Let's float into the smaller details. What did royals do all day? Hygiene. Royals were big on bathing and perfume. They had ointments for skin, kohl for eyeliner, and wigs to cover thinning hair. Think less natural beauty, and more ancient glam squad. Pets, cats, obviously. Also baboons, monkeys, and even trained lions. Because when you're king, why stop at a house cat when you can have a literal jungle predator lounging by your throne? Leisure. Board games like Senet were popular, as were hunting trips. Nothing like blowing off steam by spearing hippos in the Nile. Dangerous? Sure. But pharaohs weren't exactly known for restraint. And yes, they also worked. Endless rituals, meetings, religious festivals, and reviewing construction projects. Being pharaoh wasn't all fun and eyeliner. It was exhausting PR, bureaucracy, and trying to keep both nobles and gods happy without collapsing into civil war. Death always loomed. Even for the royal household, life expectancy wasn't amazing. Child mortality was high, disease was everywhere, and accidents happened. Pharaohs spent their whole lives preparing for death: tombs, mummies, spells, funerary goods. It's almost like their actual reign was just a prequel to their afterlife. Which is why so much palace life revolved around religious rituals, keeping the gods on your side, and ensuring your body and soul would be properly preserved. Because even if your dynasty collapsed in flames, your pyramid or tomb painting might last thousands of years. Priorities. So, palace life in ancient Egypt wasn't just glamour and gold. It was mud brick mansions, complicated family drama, eyeliner, hippo hunting, and enough incense to choke a sphinx. Behind all the propaganda, they were just humans. Humans with way too much food, jewelry, and responsibility. And with that, let's dim the lamps in the royal halls. In part 7, we'll step outside and wander through the afterlives of ordinary Egyptians, how they imagined eternity, what they packed for the trip, and the strange, cozy details of their eternal homes. So, first things first, why were Egyptians so into the afterlife? Life in Egypt was tough. Even if the Nile blessed you with crops, you still had to deal with disease, back-breaking labor, and the occasional pharaoh demanding you haul limestone blocks for his totally necessary pyramid. Death was never far away. Infant mortality was high, plagues happened, and even the royals weren't safe from a random infection. So people leaned into the idea that death wasn't the end. It was a continuation. A new chapter. Basically, yes, this life is miserable, but don't worry, the next one will be better, assuming you didn't tick off the gods. The soul was complicated. The Egyptian soul wasn't just one thing. It was a committee. Ka. Your life force. This needed food and drink after death. Hence all the bread and beer offerings. Ba, your personality, often depicted as a bird with a human head. Yes, a flying U-bird that could travel around but had to come back to the tomb at night. Ak, the part that actually lived on in the afterlife, if all went well. Kind of your transformed, eternal self. So keeping your body intact was crucial. If your body decayed, your Ka and Ba were basically homeless. This is why even ordinary people wanted some form of preservation, not full-on deluxe mummification, but at least a wrapped-up body in a coffin or pit. Tombs for the not-so-rich. We often picture pyramids and golden coffins, but most Egyptians had something far simpler. Ordinary folks were buried in the desert sands, sometimes with just a mat, a few pots of food, and maybe a wooden figurine. The hot sand naturally dried out bodies, giving them a budget-friendly form of mummification. Practical, if not glamorous. Over time, even peasants tried to have little coffins with painted eyes, so their spirit could see out. Others had clay Ashabti figurines, tiny servants who would, in theory, spring to life and do chores for you in the afterlife. Because apparently, working forever in the fields of eternity didn't sound appealing. Delegation was key. The road to eternity was bureaucratic. Egyptian heaven wasn't just an open gate. You had to pass tests. First stop, the Hall of Ma'at. There, the god Anubis weighed your heart against the feather of truth. Too heavy with sin. Oops, your heart got eaten by the monster Ammit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo. Basically, an ancient nightmare pet. And no, there were no do-overs. One bite, and you were erased forever. But if you passed, then you wandered into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Think lush farmland, endless sunshine, and eternal picnics with family. A perfect version of home, but without back pain from carrying baskets. The catch? You needed to know all the right spells and passwords to get there. Which is why even ordinary Egyptians tried to get a Book of the Dead, a scroll packed with magic words. Poorer people couldn't afford custom versions, so they bought mass-produced copies with blanks left for you to write in your own name. Basically the ancient equivalent of a fill-in-the-blank life insurance policy. Everyday imaginations of heaven. What's charming is how down-to-earth the Egyptian paradise really was. They didn't imagine floating on clouds or playing harps. Nope. They wanted bread, beer, sunshine, and family. The field of reeds was basically rural Egypt, but with better harvests and no tax collectors. For peasants who spent their whole lives in labor, the afterlife was still about labor, but idealized. You got to plow fields forever, but the soil was always rich, the Nile always flooded just right, and the boss never yelled. Comforting, in a repetitive sort of way. The ghost problem. And then, of course, there were ghosts. Egyptians believed the dead could linger and interact with the living, sometimes nicely, sometimes not. If your family didn't leave offerings, your ka might get cranky and start haunting them. Letters to the dead have been found, where people wrote to deceased relatives asking them to stop sending bad dreams or illnesses. Picture your great-uncle nagging you from beyond the grave because you forgot to pour beer on his tomb last week. So, keeping the dead happy wasn't just a religious duty. It was pest control. Why it mattered. For ordinary Egyptians, the afterlife gave meaning to their exhausting lives. Even if you lived in a mud hut, scratched out a living in the fields, and died at 35, you could still hope for eternal bread and beer in paradise. It was, in its way, deeply democratic. Pharaohs had pyramids, but the poorest farmer still expected eternity, just with a slightly humbler packing list. So, the Egyptian afterlife wasn't glittering gold for most people. It was a cozy, eternal version of home. A sunlit field, a loaf of bread, a jug of beer, family nearby, and maybe a cat curled up in the shade. Not a bad dream to fall asleep to. And with that, we'll gently close the tomb doors and let the spirits rest. In Part 8, we'll drift back into the living world, exploring Egyptian art, music, and everyday creativity. Because even in a land obsessed with death, people still loved beauty, rhythm, and a good paint job. We often think of Egypt in sandy beige and golden tones, but ordinary life was surprisingly colorful. Temples and tombs, even homes, were painted with bright reds, yellows, greens, and blues. The desert sun may have faded them, but in their day, they glowed like candy wrappers. And no, people didn't always hire professionals. Plenty of villagers painted simple designs on walls, pots, or furniture. Favorite themes? Lotus flowers, geese, and cats, naturally. Imagine a mud brick house with little hand-drawn doodles of lotus blossoms, the ancient version of Pinterest DIY wall art. Colors also had symbolic meanings. Green meant fertility. Blue connected to the Nile and life. Red could symbolize chaos, but also energy. White meant purity. Black was actually the color of rebirth, thanks to the rich black soil of the Nile floodplain. So yes, even their crayons came with deep metaphysical baggage. Music for work and play. The Egyptians weren't silent workers. They had music for just about everything. Work songs, farmers sang while plowing. Boatmen rowed in rhythm with chants. Bakers kneaded dough to steady beats. Basically, ancient Spotify playlists, but live. Festivals, flutes, lyres, harps, and clappers filled the air. Women often led the singing, with drums to keep the beat. Religious music, sistrums, those metal rattles, were shaken in temples to please the gods. The goddess Hathor especially liked her music loud and jangly. And while yes, there were grand orchestras in royal courts, most music was just simple, repetitive, and soothing. Imagine sitting by the Nile at sunset, listening to a neighbor pluck gently on a lute, while someone else tapped a drum. Sleepy, rhythmic, and timeless. Storytelling and scribbling. Not everyone could write, literacy was rare, but stories still floated around firesides and courtyards. Folktales about talking animals, clever peasants tricking greedy officials, or magical journeys were popular. When scribes did write them down, we get gems like The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor, basically an ancient short story where a sailor meets a giant talking snake who gives life advice. Or, The Tale of Sinew, about a courtier who flees Egypt, lives abroad, then comes home, full of regret and homesickness. So, yes, they had bedtime stories. Which means tonight, technically, we're doing what they did, letting words drift us towards sleep. Jewelry and personal style. Egyptians loved adornment. Even the poorest wore beads, shells, or faience amulets. Necklaces, anklets, rings, if you had something shiny, you wore it. It wasn't just vanity. Amulets were protective, little charms against bad luck. The Eye of Horus was especially popular, worn for health, safety, and maybe to keep away those cranky ghosts we mentioned earlier. And no, men weren't shy about it. Men, women, and children all layered jewelry. The more, the merrier. Even cats wore fancy collars. Because why shouldn't your pet be fabulous? The joy of games. After a long day in the fields or workshops, Egyptians didn't just collapse into bed. They played games. Senet, the most famous board game. A cross between checkers and snakes and ladders, with moves determined by sticks or knucklebones. Pharaohs were buried with senet boards, but ordinary folks carved grids into stone or scratched them onto mud bricks. Hounds and jackals, a race game with pegs shaped like little animals. Think of it as ancient Candyland, but with more canine imagery. Knucklebones and marbles, kids played tossing games with animal bones or pebbles. Basically, proto-dice and fidget toys. Games weren't just fun, they carried symbolic weight. Winning at Senet was sometimes framed as winning the passage into the afterlife. Which is kind of heavy for a casual family game night, but that's Egypt for you. Dance and movement. Yes, there was dance. And yes, it was sometimes very practical, funerary dances, ritual dances for the gods. But there were also lighter dances at festivals, with women twirling in linen dresses while musicians kept time. Professional dancers performed at banquets. Ordinary girls danced in village squares. Kids probably wiggled around to drums, the same way kids everywhere have danced badly for thousands of years. Dance, like music, was another way Egyptians broke up the monotony of hard labor. Which makes sense, when most of your day is spent under a brutal sun, movement that feels joyful is its own kind of survival. Artisans at work. One of the loveliest windows into Egyptian creativity is the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the workers who built the Valley of the King's Tombs. These artisans weren't rich, but they were skilled. Their walls are full of informal sketches, practice drawings, even cartoons making fun of pharaohs or bosses. One famous doodle shows a lion pouring beer for a gazelle, an inside joke that still makes us smile thousands of years later. So even in the shadow of death and empire, they found time to joke, sketch, and scribble silly animals. Creativity was woven into every level of life. Why this matters? What stands out is how ordinary their creativity was. The pyramids may dominate the skyline, but daily Egyptian art was small-scale and intimate. A painted pot. A plucked harp. A scratched board game. They didn't separate art from life. Beauty was in the way you braided your hair, the way you painted your doorway, the rhythm you tapped on a drum while kneading bread. It's quiet, homely, and profoundly human. So, tonight we've floated past the golden tombs and seen the Egypt of everyday creativity, colorful walls, lilting songs, the laughter of board games, and the shine of amulets against the sun. And in part 9, we'll let the story slowly wind toward its close as we explore festivals, feasting, and how ordinary Egyptians celebrated life, before tucking them back into the sands of history. The rhythm of festivals. Life in Egypt was punctuated by festivals. Not just once or twice a year, but constantly. The Egyptian calendar was stuffed with holy days, feast days, and random, let's parade a god down the street days. For peasants, these were rare chances to take a break from grinding work. The temples provided food and beer, music filled the air, and people danced in courtyards under lantern light. Think of it as a rotating neighborhood block party, except instead of a DJ, you got priests rattling sistrums in honor of Hathor. Food and drink. Now, feasting in Egypt wasn't Michelin star gourmet, but it was generous. Bread, always bread. Fresh, hot loaves were piled high. Sometimes flavored with honey, dates, or carob. Beer, the drink of choice. Thick, cloudy, nutritious beer. Kids drank it too, because it was safer than water. Meat, rare in daily life, but festivals meant roasted goose, lamb, or beef. Fruit, dates, figs, pomegranates. Little bursts of sweetness in a carb-heavy diet. Vegetables, onions, lettuce, garlic, cucumbers. Nothing fancy, but plenty to fill a pot. For most villagers, feasts were the one time they ate like nobles. It was communal, loud, and messy, with grease on hands and beer spilled in the dust. Which honestly sounds pretty human and relatable. Music, dancing, and joy. At festivals, the music cranked up. Harps twanged, flutes piped, drums thudded. Women swayed in linen dresses, men clapped along, children spun in circles until dizzy. The goddess Hathor was especially tied to music and joy, so her festivals were, let's just say, enthusiastic. People drank heavily, danced freely, and probably made choices they would not remember the next morning. Archaeologists have found drinking cups and party scenes painted on tomb walls that suggest Egyptians, just like us, loved a good excuse to cut loose. Religious pageantry. Every festival had a religious backbone. Gods were paraded in boats or carried in sacred shrines, while crowds lined the streets. Priests offered incense, chanted hymns, and carried out symbolic rituals. One famous festival was the Opet festival in Thebes, where the god Ammonia's statue traveled from Karnak temple to Luxor temple. For ordinary people, it meant music, food, and days off work, while also reaffirming cosmic order. Basically Mardi Gras with extra incense. Domestic celebrations. Not all joy came from big temple festivals. Families also celebrated milestones at home. Births, marriages, coming-of-age moments, all had their rituals and small parties. Marriage itself wasn't marked by a formal ceremony. Couples just agreed to live together and sometimes had a little feast with family and neighbors. Practical, simple, and probably involving bread and beer, again. Games and relaxation. We talked about board games earlier, but it's worth noting that games weren't just for kids. Adults played Senet at festivals, gambling for fun, while children chased hoops or tossed knucklebones nearby. For many villagers, a holiday was as much about downtime as it was about spectacle. Eating, drinking, playing games, telling stories. The small things that stitched joy into the harshness of desert life. Beauty and celebration. Festivals were also excuses to dress up. Men shaved and oiled their bodies, women styled their hair into elaborate braids or wigs, and both genders slathered on eyeliner. Not just for looks, it helped keep the sun out of their eyes and insects off their skin. Practical glamour. Perfumed cones of fat were sometimes placed on heads, melting slowly through the day to release fragrance. Yes, it sounds odd, but it was their version of cologne. Imagine a hot festival crowd, everyone glowing with sweat and smelling faintly of lotus oil. Why this matters? When we think of Egypt, we often imagine solemn temples, golden tombs, and endless desert silence. But the truth is, ordinary Egyptians filled their lives with music, dancing, feasting, and festivals. They didn't just endure life. They celebrated it, loudly and joyfully, whenever they got the chance. And maybe that's the gentlest lesson to carry to sleep tonight, that even in a land ruled by death and desert, people still laughed, danced, and spilled beer on the sand at sunset. So now, with our bellies full of bread and beer and our heads filled with music, we'll start winding this journey to a close. In part 10, we'll drift into our final chapter, the quiet decline of daily life in ancient Egypt, and how centuries of change slowly dimmed their world. The long arc of Egyptian time. One of the strangest things about ancient Egypt is just how long it lasted. From the first kings around 3100 BCE to the final whispers under Roman rule, we're talking nearly 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, the United States is barely 250 years old, and we already act like the Constitution is ancient. Egypt? Egypt was eternal. But eternity is heavy. Civilizations aren't marble statues, they erode. For the ordinary villager, life in 500 BCE looked, at first glance, a lot like life in 2500 BCE. Bread, beer, mud brick houses, plowing fields, praying to gods. Yet underneath that sameness, the world was shifting. Foreign boots in the sand. Egypt was never truly isolated. Invaders came and went like bad houseguests. Hyksos, around 1600 BCE, they swept in with fancy horse-drawn chariots. Egyptians eventually kicked them out, but not before borrowing their toys. Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, each left their mark, sometimes as rulers, sometimes as raiders. Persians, by the 500s BCE, Egypt was a province of the Persian Empire. Taxes flowed not to Thebes, but to Persepolis. For peasants, that meant the same plowing and sweating, but now with foreign overlords demanding tribute. The gods were still worshipped, the beer was still brewed, but the sense of, we are Egypt, eternal, began to fray. The Greek makeover. Then came Alexander the Great. You know, the guy who couldn't stop conquering until malaria or maybe bad wine finally did him in. In 332 BCE, he strolled into Egypt, declared himself pharaoh, because of course he did, and the people went along with it. After all, he promised freedom from the Persians. After Alexander died, his general Ptolemy set up shop. This gave us the Ptolemaic dynasty, yes, the one that ends with Cleopatra. Suddenly Egypt was draped in Greek fashion. Greek became the language of administration. Cities like Alexandria bloomed with libraries, theaters, and philosophers. Meanwhile, villagers still farmed barley the same way their ancestors had for centuries. So you had this bizarre two-layer society. On top, Greek-style elites arguing about Aristotle. On the bottom, Egyptian peasants hoping the Nile flooded properly. Daily life for the masses barely changed, but the feeling of cultural whiplash was real. Roman rule and the last echo. By 30 BCE, after Cleopatra's dramatic exit, snake, or maybe not, historians still argue, Egypt was officially Roman. Augustus Caesar declared it his personal property, basically his private farm. For peasants, Rome brought more taxes, more bureaucracy, and more soldiers stomping through the villages. Grain was now shipped across the Mediterranean to feed Rome's mobs. Egypt became the empire's breadbasket, but the actual bread for villagers? Still coarse, still hard, still eaten with onions. Religion shifted too. The old gods lingered, but Greek and Roman cults crept in. Eventually, Christianity would replace them, and then Islam centuries later. For the farmer in the field, though, gods were gods, prayers were prayers. One divine name swapped for another, while the plowing never stopped. The quiet fade. So, how did daily life decline? Not with fire and brimstone, but with slow erosion. Economic strain, heavy taxes drained villages dry. Cultural layering, foreign rulers cared more about their empires than Egyptian villages. Loss of autonomy, Egypt became a province, not a power. Yet what's most striking is not collapse, but continuity. Even under Romans, farmers sowed barley, women baked bread, children played senet, priests lit incense. The rhythms were stubbornly the same. Egypt didn't vanish. It just became ordinary. Once the center of the world, it slid quietly into being one corner of someone else's empire. The eternal daily life. And that, maybe, is the most Egyptian thing of all. Pharaohs rose and fell, temples crumbled, empires swapped hands. But the daily life of ordinary Egyptians, the humble bread, the cloudy beer, the music and laughter at festivals, carried on for millennia. It wasn't golden thrones or giant pyramids that made Egypt eternal. It was the people, living their ordinary lives in the shadow of the Nile. Day after day. Year after year. For 3,000 years. Closing thoughts. So tonight, as we set down our reed pens and let the torches gutter out, we've walked through the homes and hearts of ancient villagers. Their mornings were filled with chores, their afternoons with toil, their nights with stories and music. Their lives were short, hard, but also full of moments of joy, feasting, and beauty. And while the monuments grab headlines, it's these simple rhythms that remind us of what actually endures. Ordinary people. Ordinary days. An extraordinary stretch of time. So now, close your eyes, let the desert night drift in, and imagine the sound of the Nile flowing endlessly in the dark. Eternal, quiet, and calm. Falling in love, Egyptian style. First things first, marriage. In ancient Egypt, marriage was shockingly practical. There was no priest, no big temple ceremony, no official record. If a man and woman decided to live together, boom, married. Done. Of course, property contracts existed, especially for the wealthy. These spelled out things like, if he dumps her, she gets this much barley, or, if she leaves him, she owes him a donkey. Romance, yes, but with fine print. But don't let the paperwork fool you. Egyptians were romantics. They wrote love poetry on papyrus, walls, and even pottery shards. Young men compared their crushes to lotus flowers, and women wrote about sneaking out to meet lovers by the river. It's surprisingly sweet, and very human. Family life. Families were the backbone of society. A household might include parents, kids, grandparents, maybe even uncles and a stray cousin. Everyone pitched in. Children weren't seen as delicate little angels. They were expected to work young, carrying water, helping in fields, minding animals. But they were also loved. Amulets were hung around their necks to protect them from illness, and little toys have been found buried with them. Dolls, carved animals, rattles. Proof that even 3,000 years ago, kids liked to play. Women in daily life. One striking difference from many ancient cultures, Egyptian women had legal rights. They could own property, sign contracts, sue in court, and divorce their husbands. Not quite modern feminism, but a lot better than, say, classical Athens, where women were basically legal furniture. This didn't mean life was easy. Most women still cooked, cleaned, raised children, and worked alongside men in the fields. But the legal standing gave them a bit of independence, enough to run businesses, inherit estates, and manage households without a man looming overhead. Small joys and amusements. Egyptians weren't all work and chores. They had little joys. Cosmetics, men and women alike loved eyeliner. Not just for looks, it helped with the sun's glare and warded off flies. Perfumes, made of lotus, myrrh, or frankincense. Stored in pretty alabaster jars. Jewelry, amulets in the shapes of scarabs, ankhs, and eyes of Horus. Some for fashion, some for protection. Even the poorest person often wore a simple charm. Life was hard, but a little bead shaped like a god could give comfort. Superstitions and beliefs. Now, Egyptians were deeply superstitious. The world was crawling with unseen dangers, so amulets, spells, and rituals filled the gaps where logic failed. A crocodile in the Nile. Invoke Sobek, the crocodile god. Sick child. Call on Bes, the squat little household god who scared off demons. Snake in the house. A quick incantation, and you're good. Their magic was practical, everyday stuff. It wasn't about giant temple rituals, it was about keeping scorpions out of your bedroll and making sure your bread didn't mold. Pets and animals. Yes, Egyptians loved animals. Cats, of course, are famous. They weren't worshipped exactly, but they were respected, pampered, and very often adored. A cat in the house kept away mice and snakes, and sometimes doubled as a snuggly friend. Dogs were popular too. Hunting hounds and scrappy village mutts both appear in art. Monkeys and even geese show up as pets for the wealthy. And of course, donkeys were the SUVs of daily life, carrying loads through hot streets. When pets died, sometimes they were mummified, not just Pharaoh's fancy animals, but ordinary family cats. Which means even 3,000 years ago, people were sobbing into their beer over a dead pet, just like today. Festivals of love and fun. Beyond the grand festivals of Ammonius or Hathor, families had private celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries, maybe even the anniversary of surviving a flood. One especially charming tradition was offering little tokens of love. Jewelry, flowers, or carefully written notes. Some of these survived, pressed into pottery shards. Imagine someone confessing their crush in neat hieroglyphs on a broken jar. Slow texting, ancient style. Why this matters? All of this, the romances, the amulets, the pets, reminds us that Egyptians weren't just plowing machines or pyramid builders. They were people. People who sang love songs, spoiled their cats, argued with spouses, and believed a little carved scarab could keep the nightmares away. And maybe that's the best bedtime note of all, even after 3,000 years, their daily joys still feel familiar. So with that, we've padded our journey with a little more humanity. In part 12, we can wander into the world of medicine and health, because nothing says relaxing history monologue like leeches, broken bones, and garlic poultices. The fragile body in a harsh land. Life expectancy in ancient Egypt was short. If you made it past childhood, you might reach your 30s or 40s. Anything beyond 50 was considered a gift from the gods. Daily dangers were everywhere: dirty water, infections, parasites, crocodiles, yes, really, and the simple risk of breaking a bone while hauling stones. Medicine wasn't about living forever. It was about patching people up enough to get them back in the field, temple, or workshop. The healers. Egypt had doctors, or rather, SWNW. Some specialized, eye doctors, stomach doctors, even dentists. Imagine walking into a clinic carved out of mud brick, with the faint smell of herbs and incense, and a man in a linen kilt telling you he's an expert in headaches and other mysterious brain matters. There were also midwives, herbalists, and wise women who knew charms and folk remedies. Healing was a mix of practical care and magic spells, because in Egypt, you never separated the body from the spirit. Medical texts. We actually have Egyptian medical manuals. The most famous are the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus. These are long scrolls full of treatments, recipes, and instructions. Some are surprisingly practical. Honey on wounds, antibacterial, they were onto something. Willow bark for pain, yep, natural aspirin. Garlic for infections, smelly, but antimicrobial. And then, of course, some, less practical gems. Crocodile dung as a contraceptive. Questionable, on every level. Lizard's blood mixed with beer for skin problems. Spells against demons, for headaches. It's a mix of early science and wild guesswork. Dentistry, or the lack thereof. Egyptian bread was coarse, filled with grit from grinding stones. By middle age, most people's teeth were ground down, cracked, and infected. Dentists existed, but their main solution was simple: yank the tooth. No anesthesia, just steady hands and maybe a prayer to Hathor. Imagine lying in a mud brick house, staring at the ceiling, while someone leans over you with bronze pliers. Not exactly soothing. Still, they also tried fillings made of resin and honey, or splinting loose teeth with linen ties. Points for effort. Surgery, Egyptian style. The Edwin Smith Papyrus shows Egyptians' attempted surgery, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, even describing the brain after head injuries. They didn't fully understand germs, but they were practical. A broken arm? Splint it with wooden sticks and linen. A cut? Stitch it with thread, then smear honey on it. A head wound? Observe whether the patient can still talk or move. Calm, systematic, and surprisingly modern in tone. Of course, if the case was hopeless, the text sometimes just says, "This is a disease not to be treated." Translation: send them home and hope for the best. Everyday remedies. For ordinary folks, medicine was mostly herbal teas, poultices, and charms. A few greatest hits. Onions and garlic, for energy, protection, and warding off illness. Workers on the pyramids were fed them daily. Lettuce, believed to increase fertility. Beer, prescribed for stomach issues, though it probably caused as many problems as it solved. Milk and honey, given to soothe sore throats. Half kitchen cabinet, half pharmacy. Magic and medicine. No Egyptian healing was complete without magic. Spells were whispered over bandages, amulets were tied around necks, and prayers were offered to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague. One papyrus suggests writing the name of a demon on a piece of papyrus, dissolving it in water, and drinking it. Homeopathy meets Harry Potter. Did it work? Maybe not physically, but the belief gave comfort, and sometimes that's its own kind of medicine. The body and the afterlife. Health wasn't just about survival in this life. Egyptians saw the body as a vessel that needed to be preserved for the afterlife. That's why mummification mattered. Keeping the body intact meant you had a functioning form on the other side. So in a way, all their little remedies, charms, and poultices weren't just about living longer. They were about keeping the body strong enough to serve in both worlds. Why this matters? When we think about Egyptian medicine, it's easy to laugh at crocodile dung or lizard blood recipes. But step back, and it's deeply human. They experimented, they observed, they wrote things down. They tried honey and willow bark, both of which we still use in modern medicine. And they leaned on spells and amulets because, like us, they didn't have all the answers. Their world was fragile. Their bodies frail. So they combined herbs with hope, stitches with prayers. And maybe that's what medicine still is, in some way, a mix of science and comfort. So now, we've stitched the wounds, sipped the garlic beer, and tied on our protective amulets. In part 13, we'll drift into the softest corner yet, dreams, omens, and bedtime rituals in ancient Egypt. Because what better way to close a long monologue than to ask, how did they themselves fall asleep at night? Falling asleep by the Nile. Picture it. The day is done. The fields are quiet, the cattle tied, and the heat of the sun has finally bled away. People in their mud brick houses settle down on reed mats or rough linen sheets. There were no soft pillows stuffed with feathers. Most people used a headrest, a little curved piece of wood or stone that cradled the skull. Not exactly cozy by modern standards, but it kept the head cool and the bugs out of your ears. So, you close your eyes, the air smells faintly of smoke and grain dust, and the night sounds of frogs and crickets fill the dark. The world of dreams. For Egyptians, dreams weren't just random brain static. They were messages. Glimpses of the divine. Sometimes warnings, sometimes encouragement. Dream interpretation was practically a profession. We even have papyri called dream books that explain what different dreams meant. Dream of eating crocodile meat? Bad news. It means trouble with the law. Dream of drinking warm beer? Congratulations, you will be happy. One of the more relatable entries. Dream of seeing yourself in a mirror? Misfortune on the way. Dream of having a feast? Good times ahead. It's half psychology, half superstition, but it shows how seriously they took the sleeping mind. Dreams as divine messages. Temples sometimes served as sleep sanctuaries. If you had a problem, an illness, a question, a deep worry, you might spend the night in a temple, hoping that God would appear in your dream with an answer. Imagine lying on a stone floor in a dark, incense-heavy chamber, waiting for a dream visit from Thoth, the god of wisdom. It's both eerie and soothing. A whole culture of spiritual sleep therapy. Protective amulets at bedtime. Night wasn't just about rest. It was also a little scary. Darkness meant snakes, scorpions, and, in their worldview, wandering spirits. So people often went to bed with protective charms. Scarab amulets, symbolizing rebirth. Eye of Horus charms, for protection. Little household gods, like Bes, the squat, cheerful protector who guarded families and children at night. Bes was especially popular in bedrooms. He was short, bearded, a bit ugly, but in a lovable way. He kept nightmares and demons at bay. Basically, the ancient Egyptian version of a nightlight. Rituals before sleep. Bedtime might include a prayer to the gods, burning a bit of incense, drinking a calming herbal beer, Egyptian chamomile tea, if you like, or even just listening to family members tell old myths until sleep arrived. It was a rhythm of repetition, familiar and slow. The texture of night. We imagine Egypt as blazing sunlight and golden temples, but half of their lives unfolded in the dark. Nights were cool, quiet, and expansive. Out in the villages, the stars stretched endlessly above the desert. Without electricity, darkness wrapped around everything like a second skin. You'd hear the Nile lapping, a donkey braying in the distance, or the sigh of the wind moving through reeds. For most people, sleep came not in one long stretch but in phases, a first sleep, a waking period in the middle of the night to pray or stoke the fire, and then a second sleep until dawn. Slow, cyclical, steady. Why it matters. When you think about it, their dreams and rituals sound a lot like ours. We still search our dreams for meaning. We still keep lucky charms, say prayers, or set intentions before bed. We still want the night to feel safe, comforting, and free of chaos. The Egyptians just put it all into their worldview of gods, amulets, and cosmic order. For them, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a sacred bridge to another realm. Drifting away. So now, as we lie there on a reed mat, our head perched on a wooden rest, a scarab charm at our side, and the whisper of the Nile flowing through the night, we realize that Egyptians, for all their pyramids, mummies, and hieroglyphs, also lived in the same rhythm of sleep we do. They worked, they ate, they prayed, they feared, and finally, they rested. Dreams came, omens passed, the stars wheeled overhead, and another day waited at dawn. And with that, we gently close our story. Final thought. History is often told through battles and kings. But really, it's also about the quiet hours, the moments when ordinary people lay down, closed their eyes, and simply hoped to see another sunrise. So, good night, ancient Egypt. Good night, Nile. Good night, little household gods watching over the sleeping world. The heart of the household. Despite the temples, the pharaohs, and all that monumental stone, Egyptian life was really centered on the family home. Mud brick walls, small courtyards, reed mats, children running underfoot. Most people lived in extended families, with grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all tucked into the same compound. It was noisy. It was crowded. And it was how life worked. Marriage, Egyptian style. Marriage wasn't a big formal ceremony with priests and doves. In most cases, it was simply two people agreeing to live together, sometimes with a contract if property was involved. The tone was practical: she will be my wife, and I will not say otherwise. That's literally how some contracts read. Romantic. But don't let the dry legal wording fool you. Egyptians also wrote love poetry, some of the earliest in history. Lines about yearning hearts, sweet voices, and the joy of meeting a beloved by the river. Tender, quiet stuff. So yes, they knew about both contracts and butterflies. Children everywhere. Children were considered blessings, though probably also noisy blessings. Families were big, partly because high child mortality meant not every little one survived. Kids ran barefoot, played games, helped with chores, and often wore just a bead necklace until they were older. Boys sometimes had their heads shaved with just one side lock of hair left, a kind of cultural haircut that marked them as children. And yes, parents worried about them constantly, especially from scorpions, disease, and the Nile itself. Protective amulets and prayers were a constant part of child-rearing. Roles in the household. Men usually worked in fields or workshops. Women managed the home, baked bread, brewed beer, and wove linen. But Egyptian women also had notable rights compared to other ancient cultures. They could own property, sign contracts, and even divorce husbands. So in many cases, the household was a partnership, sometimes unequal, sometimes balanced, always practical. Love and affection. Family affection shows up everywhere in tomb art. Husbands and wives are painted holding hands, sitting side by side. Children are shown perched on parents' laps or clutching their legs. It wasn't a cold or distant culture. People clearly cherished those small bonds of touch and presence. And in poetry, young lovers call each other my sister or my brother, not literally, but as a term of closeness. Sweet, if a little confusing out of context. Divorce and breakups. Yes, Egyptians had divorce. If things didn't work out, either partner could initiate it, and property was divided according to the marriage contract. It was more practical than scandalous. Society accepted that sometimes things just ended. And honestly, there's something strangely modern in that. A 3,000-year-old culture, and still people had breakups, settlements, and the awkward dividing of bread ovens. Old age and memory. Few reached old age, but those who did were honored. Gray hair and wrinkles were respected as signs of wisdom. Families cared for elders at home, not in separate places. And when someone passed, memory was everything. To speak their name, to remember their deeds, was to keep them alive in the afterlife. Family ties didn't end at death, they simply stretched into eternity. Why this matters? It's tempting to imagine ancient Egyptians as stiff figures carved in stone. But behind those hieroglyphs were warm kitchens, noisy kids, small disagreements, and quiet love. They courted, married, raised children, argued over chores, and worried late into the night, just like us. Strip away the pyramids, and you find people living out the same fragile, messy, affectionate cycles we do today. Drifting home. So here we are, at the very heart of ancient Egypt. The household. Bread baking in clay ovens, children playing in the dust, parents laughing quietly after a long day. It's not golden tombs or great battles. It's something softer, the rhythm of people loving and caring for one another, night after night, for centuries. And maybe that's the most sleep-worthy thought of all. Cats, of course. Let's start with the obvious. Cats. Egyptians adored them. Not just because they're cute, though clearly they are, but because they were useful. Cats hunted mice and snakes, keeping food stores safe. Over time, cats became semi-divine. Associated with Batet, the goddess of home and protection, cats were sacred, sleek, and untouchable. Killing one, even by accident, could get you into serious trouble. Some families even mummified their cats, laying them gently to rest. Imagine explaining that to modern vets. Yes, I'd like to preserve Mr. Whiskers for eternity. Dogs, the loyal companions. Dogs were also beloved, though less glamorized. They helped with hunting, guarded homes, and were constant companions. Egyptians named them things like, Brave One, or Good Nose. Very practical naming scheme. Tomb paintings sometimes show entire families with their dogs trotting alongside. A reminder that even in a land of pyramids, people just wanted their pets near. Donkeys and oxen, the real workers. Most animals weren't pets, of course. Donkeys carried goods along dusty roads, often overworked but indispensable. Oxen pulled plows, slow but steady, feeding the nation with their labor. They weren't worshipped. They weren't adored. But without them, fields stayed barren, and bread didn't exist. Uncelebrated heroes, really. Sacred cows and holy crocodiles. Then we get to the strange middle ground, animals as divine symbols. The Apis bull in Memphis was worshipped as a living god, chosen by priests for special markings. Treated with luxuries, garlanded in gold, until eventually mummified and laid in grand sarcophagi. Not a bad gig for a cow. Meanwhile, in the Fayum region, crocodiles linked to Sobek lounged in sacred pools. Some were fed, honored, and, yes, mummified too. The mix of fear and reverence says a lot. People didn't want to anger the crocodile gods, so they kept them well fed. Sensible. Birds and monkeys. Egyptians also kept geese, pigeons, and even monkeys. Geese were food, pigeons carried messages, and monkeys, well, monkeys were mainly for entertainment. We have tomb art of monkeys wearing collars, perched on shoulders, probably stealing fruit when no one was watching. A cute idea, until you remember how destructive monkeys can be. Imagine an ancient scribe trying to write while a monkey throws ink. Horses arrive late. Interestingly, horses weren't part of early Egyptian life. They only showed up around the time of the Hyksos, roughly the 2nd millennium BCE. Quickly, they became the prestige animals of war, pulling chariots, symbols of speed and royal power. Not common in villages. But in temples and royal courts, horses were sleek, shiny status symbols. Mummified animals everywhere. If you think cat mummies were odd, wait. Archaeologists have found massive animal necropolises, cemeteries filled with mummified ibises, falcons, crocodiles, fish, and more. Millions of them. Some were sacred offerings, others sold as pre-packaged votives to worshippers. A kind of spiritual gift shop. One ibis mummy, please, to go. Animals in daily thought. To Egyptians, animals weren't just practical. They were constant metaphors. The scarab beetle symbolized rebirth. Hawks meant power and vision. Jackals meant death but also protection. Everywhere you turned, animals slipped between the practical, the sacred, and the symbolic. Both companions and cosmic guides. A gentle picture. So picture it, a mud brick courtyard. A cat slinking past a basket of bread. A dog dozing in the shade. Chickens scratching, donkeys braying, and maybe a monkey stealing figs from the kitchen. It's noisy, a little chaotic, but also home. A world where humans and animals lived so closely that the line between daily life and myth blurred. And when night fell, those same animals curled near the hearth, guardians, nuisances, companions, gods. drifting with them. So as we close, imagine falling asleep not in a grand pharaoh's palace, but in a small village home. A cat purring at your feet. A dog breathing softly nearby. The sounds of donkeys in the distance. Ordinary people. Ordinary animals. All tangled together in one timeless rhythm. So here we are. We've spent hours together, floating down the slow current of ancient Egypt. From dusty village streets to crowded temples, from noisy markets to quiet tombs, we've tiptoed through their daily lives. We've talked about farmers bent over their fields. Bakers kneading gritty bread. Children chasing each other barefoot in the dust. We've lingered in the flicker of lamps, smelled the smoke of cheap beer brewing, and peeked into dreams where God slipped in to whisper. And now, at the end, it all blends together into one sleepy rhythm. The small things that mattered. The more we looked, the more it became clear, life wasn't about pyramids or pharaohs, not really. Those are the headlines, the stone monuments left for us to gawk at thousands of years later. But the real heartbeat of Egypt was in the ordinary. The scratch of reed pens. The clatter of donkey hooves. The sound of a mother scolding her child for playing too close to the Nile. The smell of onions frying, cats circling for scraps, neighbors gossiping in doorways. All the things that never made it into hieroglyphs, but somehow survived anyway. The eternal flow. Egyptians themselves understood this fragility. They wrapped their dead carefully. They told stories of afterlives where fields were always green and the Nile always flowed gently. But in some way, the afterlife they imagined is what we're doing now. Remembering them. Saying their names out loud, even if the names are long faded. And that's enough to keep their small, ordinary world breathing. Why it's sleep-friendly. If you've been listening this whole time, maybe your eyes are heavy now. That's fine. That's the point. Because Egyptian life wasn't always exciting. It was repetitive, cyclical, seasonal. The flood came, the fields grew, the harvest ended, the flood came again. People woke, worked, worried, loved, and slept. Just as we do. And that endless, calm repetition makes the perfect lullaby. Closing the lamps. So let's picture one last scene. A small mud brick house, somewhere near the Nile, 3,000 years ago. The day is over. The bread is eaten. The donkey is tied up. Children have curled onto mats, whispering until sleep takes them. A cat settles on someone's lap. A clay lamp burns low. Outside, frogs croak and reeds sway in the night breeze. Nothing more is happening. Nothing more needs to. Just life, small and ordinary, carrying on in the quiet dark. And here we rest. So let's leave it there. With the lamp flickering. With the Nile sliding by. With people long gone still breathing through memory. Thank you for drifting through it with me. Close your eyes. Let the past dissolve. Let the hum of daily life, so far away and so familiar, carry you gently into sleep. Good night. The things we didn't talk about. Whenever you spend this much time wandering through a world, there are always little scraps left behind. Loose ends. Quiet details that don't quite fit anywhere, but are still worth letting float past. Like how Egyptians sometimes used honey as medicine. Or how sandals made from palm fiber wore out in a week, so barefoot was easier. Or how beer jugs often had strainer tops built in, because the stuff was so chunky you didn't want to swallow it straight. Not dramatic. Not headline-worthy. Just, life. Sticky, sandy, slightly inconvenient life. Odd jobs and small trades. Not everyone farmed. Some carved stone beads, others hammered copper pins, others sold reeds for mats. In villages, there were pot menders, basket weavers, even the occasional hired mourner who would show up at funerals to wail loudly. Yes, that was a real profession. Imagine putting that on your resume. People also worked on boats, hauling fish or passengers. Or ferried goods to market in little reed skiffs that looked like floating bundles of straw. Quiet jobs. Small hands making small things, all to keep life turning smoothly. The texture of time. One thing about Egypt is how little changed, century after century. A villager in 500 BCE would have recognized the tools, the houses, even the recipes from 2000 BCE. Imagine living in a world where things stayed steady for 2.5 millennia. No rushing forward. No industrial revolutions. Just time moving in long, slow ripples. Which, honestly, is why it makes such good bedtime history. Nothing jolts. Nothing surprises. Just the same old Nile, flowing on. Nights by the river. And since this is a sleepy add-on, let's settle once more by the riverbank. The reeds are whispering. Boats creak as they bump against poles. The water carries little clusters of lotus flowers, drifting quietly downstream. A fisherman pulls in his net, heavy with tilapia. Somewhere nearby, a child hums a tune while chasing fireflies. The smell of cooking onions drifts on the breeze. Nothing special. Just another night. The long silence. And maybe that's the best way to end again, with silence. After the frogs croak, and the fires fade, and the village sighs itself to sleep, there's only the quiet. That long silence of people who lived, loved, worried, worked, and finally rested. The same silence you can sink into now. So if your eyes are still open, let them close. If your mind is still circling, let it drift. The Egyptians are already asleep, and maybe it's time you joined them. The flavors of ordinary Egypt. Let's talk food again, but this time, in smaller bites. Because people didn't live on pottage alone. They loved onions so much that Greek visitors joked Egyptians worshipped them. Which, honestly, they sort of did. Onions were cheap, filling, and stored well. Garlic was everywhere too, crushed into bread dough, boiled in stews, probably shoved at anyone who caught a cold. Imagine living in a village where everyone had garlic breath, all the time. Romantic, right? Sweetness came from dates and honey. Date cakes, date beer, date syrup. Basically, if you could mash it into a paste, you did. The questionable medicines. Egyptian medicine, let's just say it was creative. They had good ideas, like using honey on wounds, which actually works as an antiseptic. But they also had less good ideas. Like mixing crocodile dung with fermented dough and applying it as a contraceptive. Which, you know, probably didn't help much beyond scaring people off. Or treating headaches with dried fish parts tied to your head. Imagine sitting in the sun with that accessory. Still, there was a real medical class, physicians who wrote detailed manuals. And some remedies were surprisingly smart, like willow bark for pain, basically the ancestor of aspirin. So, half miracle, half medieval kitchen disaster. Music to drift on. Life wasn't all onions and poultices. Egyptians had music, too. Simple harps, flutes, rattles, and drums. Songs for work, for love, for rituals. Archaeologists even found lyrics scratched on shards of pottery. Things like, drink, be happy, life is short. Which sounds exactly like something written on a pub wall today. So you can picture villagers tapping rhythms on a jar, humming while grinding grain, or chanting softly at night under the stars. Music as background to an otherwise sandy, repetitive existence. The whisper of amulets. And of course, no Egyptian would feel fully dressed without amulets. Tiny charms tucked into clothing or hung around the neck. Eyes of Horus, scarabs, little copper cats. Each promised some small protection, health, fertility, luck, or just, please don't let me die of food poisoning. Children especially wore amulets, tied with cords around their chests. They jingled faintly when kids ran. Maybe annoying for the parents, but hey, better than demons sneaking in at night. A slow drift. And that's how life was: repetitive meals, questionable cures, soft songs, little charms. Nothing rushed. Nothing wild. Just one day rolling into the next. If you're still awake, let that image linger: a clay house with onion stews bubbling, a flute humming somewhere in the dusk, a child tugging at a necklace charm. Small details, quietly glowing against the endless desert. The kind of memory that doesn't need drama to last. Just the softness of ordinary people, living out their days. How the ancient Egyptians slept. The beds, sort of. If you picture a bed in ancient Egypt, erase the fluffy mattress from your head. What you really got was a wooden frame, sometimes curved so your body didn't just roll off. A net of woven reeds or rope stretched across, with a straw mat tossed on top. If you were rich, maybe a cushion stuffed with reeds. For the poor, a reed mat directly on the floor. If you were unlucky, sand. Let's just say nobody was bouncing into deep memory foam. And yet, people managed. Because when you've spent all day hauling water jars, even a bundle of reeds feels luxurious. The pillows of stone. Yes, stone pillows. Okay, technically, headrests. They were carved from wood, ivory, or stone, shaped like little stands with a curved top. The head rested in the curve, keeping the neck elevated. Was it comfortable? Probably not. But the logic was: keep your head off the ground so bugs don't crawl into your ears. Which is a priority, I suppose. We don't know how well Egyptians slept, but I'm guessing, not great. Lullabies and soothing songs. Despite the hard mats and stone pillows, there were lullabies. Gentle songs hummed by mothers while rocking babies. The words don't always survive, but fragments do. Things like, go to sleep, little one, don't let the crocodile take you. Which isn't exactly, twinkle, twinkle. But hey, it worked. Imagine the sound: soft chanting, a little drum beat, maybe a rattle shaking slowly. Babies fussed, babies dozed. Same as now, just with more crocodile warnings. Nighttime superstitions. Egyptians believed night was when dangerous spirits roamed. Dreams were messages, sometimes from gods, sometimes from lurking demons. To protect yourself, you wore amulets or recited spells before bed. Some people even had little clay figurines buried near their sleeping mats, guardians to fight off nightmares. Dream manuals survive, too. They'd tell you things like, if you dream of eating crocodile meat, it means you will gain strength. Or, if you dream of being bitten by a dog, trouble is coming. Basically, the world's first dream dictionaries. The quiet of the night. So picture it: a village settling down. The fires are embers. The stars are fierce in the desert sky. Dogs bark at the edge of town. Families lie on mats, heads propped on wooden stands, wrapped in linen sheets against the chill. Children drift off to lullabies about crocodiles, while parents mutter protective prayers. It's not glamorous. But it's steady. And it's the same hush you feel now, waiting for your own sleep to come. A final drift. And maybe this is the right place to stop. We've walked through fields, into houses, down markets, and finally into the silence of night. Ancient Egypt is long gone. But sleep is eternal. People then and people now, both listening to lullabies, worrying about bad dreams, and hoping for rest. So close your eyes, and let their world fade into yours. The river still flows. The reeds still whisper. The night still belongs to everyone. Pets in the house. Egyptians adored animals, and not just cats. Sure, cats get all the glory, sleek, mysterious, sometimes mummified with more care than their owners. But people also kept monkeys, geese, even ibises. Wealthier households might have a pet dog with a collar carved with its name. Some tombs even show children tugging goats on leashes. Which, if you've ever met a goat, you know was probably chaos. But hey, it counts as a pet. So bedtime in an Egyptian home wasn't silent. Cats knocking jars off shelves. Dogs barking at shadows. Ducks waddling in through the open door. A low-level farmyard hum inside your living space. Clothing as comfort. Let's drift into fabric. Linen was king. Light, breathable, and blessedly cool in the heat. People wore it plain, or starched into stiff pleats if you were showing off. At night, most just kept things simple. A loose linen shift, maybe nothing at all in summer. Children often went naked until age 6 or 7 anyway, which makes sense when you live in a land where laundry is basically scrubbing sand out of fabric forever. So the bedtime pajamas of ancient Egypt? Mostly just linen. Or skin. Efficient either way. The smell of the night. Not glamorous, but important. Egyptian towns weren't exactly fragrant. With animals, cooking fires, and no plumbing, you can guess the aroma. But people tried. Incense was burned, oils rubbed on skin, lotus petals steeped in jars of water. Rich households had scented cones of wax placed on the head, slowly melting through the evening to release perfume. Imagine trying to fall asleep with a little candle-shaped lump of grease on your hair. Not ideal, but at least you smelled better. Gossip by firelight. Evenings weren't just sleeping. Families sat around low fires, telling stories. Not grand myths every time, sometimes just gossip. Who bought a new donkey, who shorted their grain measure, who flirted too much at the market. Egyptians loved stories of gods, but they also loved tales of tricksters, or workmen complaining about lazy overseers. The kind of chatter that winds down slowly until voices fade and the fire dies out. So the soundtrack of the night wasn't silence. It was murmurs, laughter, sighs. The universal bedtime lull of people winding down after long, dusty days. A pause at the river. And let's end, again, with the river. Always the river. Because no matter how chaotic the animals, how creased the linen, or how loud the gossip, the Nile never stopped flowing. You could always step outside, look across the dark water, and hear its endless hush. Boats creaked in the current. Frogs sang. The reeds whispered like an old lullaby. It was the same every night. Steady. Predictable. Eternal. One more good night. And with that, we can let the lights fade once more. Egypt has given us onions, headrests, crocodile lullabies, and gossiping neighbors. And yet it all feels so familiar. Humans, then and now, just trying to eat, rest, and get through the day without too much chaos. So breathe slow. Sink back. The night belongs to you, as much as it did to them. The household tools. We've talked about beds and food, but what about the little stuff? Homes were full of baskets, big ones, little ones, all woven from reeds. You couldn't move an inch without bumping into one. They stored grain, laundry, tools, even kids sometimes, if the artwork is to be believed. Clay jars lined the walls, holding water, beer, oil. And because pottery broke constantly, shards were everywhere. People scribbled notes on broken pots instead of wasting expensive papyrus. Grocery lists, receipts, love notes, all on pottery scraps. Imagine your text messages forever stuck on pieces of smashed bowls. The little luxuries. Even ordinary people had small pleasures. A carved comb, a copper mirror, Maybe a bead necklace made from faience, that bright blue-green glazed stuff that looked fancy even if it wasn't. Women lined their eyes with kohl not just for beauty, but because it helped cut glare from the sun. Which means half the village looked like it had dramatic eyeliner all day, every day. Somewhere in the afterlife, Cleopatra was probably rolling her eyes at peasants trying out her look. The noise of the day. Daytime Egypt wasn't quiet. Donkeys brayed, geese honked like broken trumpets, and work gangs sang rhythmic chants while hauling stone. Even inside a village, you'd hear grinding stones scraping grain, children shrieking in games, men shouting at goats that refused to cooperate. So nighttime really mattered, that hush after the clamor, when the desert finally cooled and everyone could breathe. Scribbles and schooling. Not everyone could write, of course. Literacy was rare. But children of scribes learned to copy signs on shards of pottery. Over and over again. Sentences like, "A boy's ear is on his back, he listens only when beaten." Which is one way to run a classroom, I guess. So even in education, life was repetitive. Write, scrape, repeat. A slow grind of signs and symbols. And for most, it never went beyond that. Farmers farmed. Bakers baked. But those who could write, even a little, had a kind of magic. The magic of leaving a mark. The eternal sand. And always, the sand. In clothes, in food, in teeth. Mummies today show worn-down molars, because every loaf of bread had tiny grains of sand baked in. Daily chewing doubled as dental destruction. Sand coated everything, but people stopped noticing. The desert wasn't an intruder. It was just, there. A quiet companion, filling every crack, settling on every reed mat. One more fade. So if you're still with me, picture the scene, baskets stacked in corners, jars leaning against walls, geese still muttering themselves to sleep. Children scribbling signs on broken pottery. Adults brushing sand from their clothes, knowing it will be back tomorrow anyway. It's not glamorous. It's not epic. But it's real. The small, stubborn heartbeat of life. The return of evening. We've circled the day so many times now, but let's go back once more. Imagine the heat pulling away as the sun slides down. Shadows lengthen. The air actually feels breathable again. And in that moment, you'd hear little things, like the creak of reed doors, the splash of water poured into jars, the cough of someone clearing their throat after a day of dust. It's nothing dramatic. Just the soundscape of a world winding down. Family gatherings. Inside the mud-brick homes, families sat together. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, even neighbors who wandered in. The evening meal wasn't elaborate. Maybe bread, maybe onions, maybe lentils. But it was shared, and it was quiet. People sat cross-legged on mats, hands reaching into shared bowls. No forks, no knives. Just fingers, bread used as scoops. And when the food was gone, the conversation trickled down into little murmurs. Someone humming. Someone sharpening a tool absent-mindedly. A child falling asleep in a corner, cheek pressed against a woven basket. The glow of firelight. There wasn't much light after dark. Oil lamps flickered, tiny flames dancing in clay bowls filled with castor oil or animal fat. The glow was weak, but enough to see faces and walls painted warm orange. And because flames needed tending, someone always leaned in to adjust a wick, or add another drop of oil. That slow, repetitive motion, feed the flame, settle back, feed it again. It gave evenings a rhythm, soft and steady. Dreams of tomorrow. Even ordinary Egyptians thought a lot about dreams. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was a doorway. The gods could drop in with advice, warnings, or just weird imagery to puzzle over. There were even dream books written by scribes, where you could look up what it meant if, say, you dreamed of eating crocodile. Spoiler, not usually a great sign. So when people drifted off, they weren't just looking for rest. They were hoping for a message, too. Maybe a blessing. Maybe a clue. Maybe nothing at all. The weight of silence. And outside, silence. The village sounds gone. The Nile drifting dark and endless, carrying the soft plop of a fish jumping. Wind stirring through date palms. A donkey shifting in its sleep. That silence was never total. But it was heavy enough to press on you, reminding you that tomorrow would be the same. The same fields. The same bread. The same sand in your teeth. And somehow, that sameness was comfort. Life wasn't exciting. It wasn't supposed to be. It was steady. Predictable. Like the Nile itself. Closing the circle. So here we are, back at night, back at quiet. We've walked the full circle of the day, the season, the year, the life of ordinary Egyptians. Nothing glamorous. Nothing thrilling. Just people getting by, doing their best under the same sky you see when you look up tonight. And maybe that's why it still feels calming, thousands of years later. Because the rhythm hasn't really changed. Work, food, family, sleep. Then repeat. So if your eyes are heavy now, that's good. Let them close. Drift down into your own version of an ancient Nile night. Quiet water. Warm air. The soft murmur of a world that never really went away. And tomorrow? Well, tomorrow we'll find some other corner of history to wander into. But for now, just rest. Just sleep. Good night.